The Mastodon is perhaps the largest ground transport the Astartes ever fielded. It can field a huge contingent of Marines and acts as a siege battering ram equipped with very heavy weaponry. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Mastodon of the Space Marines. The Mastodon is one of my personal favorite Horus heresy units, just on looks alone, and its concept is really cool, and it's named after Mastodons, and I like Mastodons. Mastodon comes in at 610 points. It moves 9 inches, its toughness 14 with a 2+ save and 30 wounds, 6+ leadership and OC 12. So this thing is very resilient to most kinds of anti-tank weapons and needs very, very dedicated anti-titan and anti-super heavy weaponry to damage effectively. In terms of ranged weapons, it of course has las cannons, which are 1 attack that hit on 3s at 40 inch range, with strength 12, AP 3, and damage D6 plus 1. The Siege Melta array is its main event, with Melta 2, 24 inch range, with 6 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 9, AP 4, and damage D6. This is of course a very, very nasty amount of Melta fire, though it will need some buffs to really go the distance. The Heavy Bolter is sustained hits 1, at 3 attacks that hit on 3s at 36 inch range, with strength 5, AP 1, and damage 2. The Heavy Flamer is Torrent Ignores Cover, D6 attacks that auto hit at 12 inch range, with strength 5, AP 1, and damage 1. The Volkite Culverin is Devastating Wounds, 4 attacks that hit on 3s at 36 inch range, with strength 6, AP 0, and damage 2. The Sky Reaper Battery is Anti-Fly 4+, 8 attacks that hit on 3s at 36 inch range, with strength 7, AP 1, and damage 2. In terms of melee weapons, it's just Armored Tracks, 6 attacks that hit on 4s at strength 8, AP 0, damage 1. Not good melee, but you wouldn't expect that. In terms of weapons, of course, I believe the las cannons and Siege Melta arrays are its best, though I think the Volkite Culverins have a place if just wanting to get some extra dev wounds in the army. In terms of abilities, it has Deadly Demise 2d6, so a massive explosion, and this thing is huge, so it will cover a large area, so make sure to clear out when this thing's about to blow. Inviolable Transport is its main ability. Once per battle, when an attack is allocated to this model, you can change that damage characteristic to 0. This is very useful against things like volcano cannons, railguns, anything of the like that could threaten this thing with a lot of damage, especially if it's wounding it on 3s, just to make it so that it's less effective in general. In terms of transport, unsurprisingly, it has huge transport at 45 Astartes infantry models. Each possessed Terminator, Gravis, Jump Pack, or Wolfen take up 2 slots. Centurions and Obliterators take up 3. This model can also transport 2 dreadnoughts, with each dreadnought taking up a amount of spots equal to their wound count, i.e. a dreadnought of 8 wounds would take 8 slots. This is one of, if not the largest transport in the game. It might be second to the Manta or the, Thunderhawk. But even still, just for the points cost, I don't think you're going to get bigger than this. It really can transport anything you could imagine, and allows for a lot of fun to be had with just how much stuff you can cram in here, and the fact that it can transport effectively anything that has legs, from infantry to walkers. Of course, I would generally steer clear of transferring things like Jump Pack, but that's a given. In terms of loadout, it of course comes standard with 2 Heavy Flamers, 2 las cannons, a Siege Melta array, the Sky Reaper battery, and Armored Tracks. This model's 2 Heavy Flamers can be replaced with one of the following: 2 las cannons, 2 Heavy Bolters, or 2 Volkite Culverins. This model's 2 las cannons can be replaced with one of the following: 2 Heavy Bolters, 2 Heavy Flamers, 2 Volkite Culverins. In general, I would just bring the 4 las cannon setup, as I believe the las cannons offer the best bang for your buck, as the heavy bolters are mainly a sort of nice-to-have weapon, not what I would build around, and the Volkite Culverins are a nice alternative if you just want to go maximally on devastating wounds, and can be very useful, especially if you have something like reroll wounds from, say, the Undivided Stratagem in the Packbound Zealots. Sorry, I completely lost my train of thought there for a moment. We are going to move on to the Loyalist buff options, though, from the Loadout. And of course, the first thing to call out with the buffs is Tech Marines. They keep it healthier and even more accurate, with them hitting on 2s instead of 3s. Generally very useful, and this thing's slow enough that even with a low advanced roll, the Tech Marine can very easily keep up. The Thunderstrike can give you +1 to wound against monsters, which is great, though I'd really say only useful if you're bringing it outside of a Divergent chapter. Oh, excuse me. As of course you would be overlapping with the Oath of Moment rules when you bring this ability, which of course is, again, overlapping. It's redundant. The Primarchs of Guilliman and the Lion offer mortal resistance, which are both very useful for such a beefy unit. In terms of transport units, Redemptors come to mind as the best transports to the best dreadnoughts to transport, whether it be Brutalis or regular Redemptors. as they will take up a good amount of space, but there will still be plenty of room to fit any sort of insanely dangerous unit you want into. And throwing out 2 super tough vehicles will really make the opponent's decisions very difficult. And in terms of the rest of the space, it's really hard to say any one thing is best, since you can fit anything and everything in here. You could do 20 Terminators, 45 Assault Intercessors, 12 Centurions, and really any other combination of insane amounts of Space Marines you want to just run out of this thing at the enemy. Of course, though, whatever you want to put in there, I would make sure it's something that's threatening. And while I did mainly list melee things, of course this thing does not have Disembark and Charge, so you would need to get that from another source. And in general, that does mean there is definitely some purpose to bringing a ranged unit, but of course you could just keep this thing stationary, disembark, and have everyone run off and do their own thing. Next we're going to move on to the trader buff options, which are perhaps a little bit more limited, though I wouldn't say terribly. The Warpsmith comes to mind as, again, just a trader version of the Tech Marine, keeps it healthy and more accurate. The Sorcerer in Terminator armor gives it extra AP to one target within a certain range, which is slightly overkill, but it is nice for the las cannons mainly, as AP 5 is mostly overkill, though it would completely destroy every save in the game. I wanted to mention Abaddon, as of course he gives rerolls to attacks, as well as extra CP generation, and reroll leadership can have its uses just to give more chance for it to get no mortal wounds on a Dark Pact test if you're using Pact-bound Zealots. And in terms of transports, I wanted to shout out the Hellbrutes, as they are very dangerous in melee, far more than they are at range, so giving them an extremely tough battle taxi is great, as they are painfully slow on foot. And again, same with the Loyalist, you can put anything in here. Obliterators offer great anti-tank, Terminators offer a lot of super tough melee, and of course this thing can transport humongous amounts of both Legionaries or even Chosen. If you wanted to go whole hog, you could have 30 Chosen in this thing with a full character complement for each of them, which is pretty crazy to think about, and would be just absolutely hilarious to see on the battlefield. Just because of how many Marines would jump out, I genuinely think you would run into issues of running out of space to put them. But that's not really a main thing I would do, as I mentioned. The sky is the limit with this thing. You can put almost anything in here so long as it has legs. Which is just pretty funny in my opinion. But, again, pretty similar. Abaddon gives nice buffs, Warpsmith is always good, and the Sorcerer has its place. Though, I'd say, again, the extra AP is slightly overkill in a lot of situations. Next, we're going to move on to the Loyalist attachments. Gladius is, of course, very solid. Assault is nice on its weaponry, fallback and charge is nice to have, and again, once you just, on turn 2, say, you disembark everyone and advance and charge is great with Assault Doctrine. Ironstorm Spearhead can give you some nice rerolls, and 5+ sustained hits is great on something this enormous, just because that Melta array really does appreciate getting extra hits. Though the Anvil Siege Force arguably does it better with its 5+ sustained. Of course, you do need to remain stationary for that. It is a very nice touch, though, that you get heavy, so it makes fishing significantly more advantageous, as you're much less likely to run out of... You're much less likely to roll any ones, because, again, you hit on every other result. And everything else, this thing just offers an enormous unit to transport whatever you want, whether it be extremely dangerous range troopers or extremely powerful melee units. This thing can really do it all. And of course, it can bring along a giant amount of dreadnought body with it. Though, of course, it will, I'd say, mainly excel in these 3 detachments. I'm sure there may be one I'm missing, but these are the 3 that immediately come to mind. In terms of trader detachments, though, Pact-bound does give it 5+ lethals, which are very nice for the Meltas. Or you can get the reroll wounds from Undivided, as I mentioned, and Skin Shift gives it extra healing, which could stack with a Warpsmith or some certain Crusade rules, like Living Hull from the Chaos Space Marines, of course. Siege Host gives it -1 to wound against higher strength, which may seem pointless, but this is very useful against things like Hammerhead railguns, for example, or even Volcano Cannons. Soulforged can give it +1 to wound at range, and extra AP does have its uses, though again, slightly overkill. And in everything else, again, offers an enormous unit to transport all the threat you can dream of, while destroying some enemy tanks, while being a massive move block and extremely tough unit. Some other things you could do, you could definitely have some very dangerous, say, the Renegade Raiders detachment, of course. You have a lot of things that could jump out of this to get that buff every turn. or in Veterans of the Long War, it does appreciate the rerolls to hit, though of course it generally prefers rerolls to wound if it can get that. But that's just sort of, some small things you can do in other detachments that I did want to mention, but didn't give a full bullet point. Moving on to competition, there really isn't anything that directly competes with the Mastodon's role. There is no other super heavy ground transport that can carry this much stuff. Though in truth, there is some other super heavy tank competition that I wanted to cover, though they're not really competing the same thing. I just wanted to mention them as I feel it would be wrong not to. The Falchion, again, is a super heavy tank with a volcano cannon, so it's an anti-Titan weapon that functions very similarly to a Shadow Sword from the Imperial Guard. And the Fellblade is pretty much the Space Marine Baneblade, equipped with a main weapon with 2 profiles and a deadly set of las cannons or laser destroyers. It does offer a lot of firepower that is quite general purpose, though again, it's not only cheaper, but it doesn't have any transport, so it's really not competing for the same slot as the Mastodon. There really is nothing in the Mastodon's points class that does the same thing. Could mention the Thunderhawk, but the Thunderhawk is 250 points more expensive, and the Sokar Patent Stormbird is 500 points more expensive, actually. So I wouldn't really consider them to be in the same class, as they're just so much more expensive, though I would also say infinitely worse than the Mastodon is. Of course, so there's nothing that really competes with it, but I did just want to mention these more damage-oriented super heavy tanks for the Space Marines. And I could have mentioned the Astrius, but I just don't really think it's even worth mentioning. Because the vibes are completely different, and of course, it fills a different role. Moving on to the, of course, next section, we have its best uses, where we wrap up everything. The Mastodon is pretty unique. I believe it is the largest ground transport in the game, and even the bigger transports, like the Manta, cost significantly more than this, at about 1,000 points or more. And of course, I am pretty confident you could fit the grand majority of a 1,000 point, or 2,000 point army in this thing. And its huge toughness and turning damage to 0 will make a lot of anti-tank weapons just bounce off it. Las cannons lose a lot of their effectiveness. Of course, you will still need to fear things like Gladiator Lancers or Hammerheads, specifically Hammerheads. But with reducing damage to 0, that can drastically reduce their effectiveness in general. So blowing this thing away in one turn without something like a Shadow Sword will be very difficult for most armies to do. And should it survive, of course, it will then unleash its huge complement of troops and dreadnoughts, which demand attention, as of course, if they focus everything on the Mastodon to finish it off, well, now there's, 20 Space Marines and 2 Redemptor Dreadnoughts about to charge into them. Or there's, they focus on the infantry, and they still have this giant Mastodon in front of them that will mess things up with its Siege Melta Array and las cannons. It will draw an immense amount of fire. Thankfully, though, once it releases, again, as I mentioned, once it gets rid of its troops, the enemy is very disencouraged to shoot at this thing because you need to focus major weaponry against it to kill it, and if they're focusing this, they're not shooting your Redemptors. So they're kind of in a lose-lose situation, and this thing could just park in the middle of the board and be completely a pain in the ass as a move block. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.